Introduction. The First World War beyond Europe. When people think of the First World War, their minds almost always drift toward the trenches of France, the shattered villages of Belgium, or the deserts of the Middle East. Yet the conflict was never confined to Europe alone. As the great imperial powers clashed on their home continents, their far-flung colonies, leased territories, and overseas concessions were inevitably pulled into the widening storm. Nowhere was this more evident than in East Asia, where rival empires found themselves drawn into a confrontation far removed from the Western Front, but no less significant in shaping the future balance of power. Among the European nations with ambitions in the Far East stood the German Empire. Though Germany's colonial holdings were modest compared to those of Britain or France, Berlin had invested heavily in projecting power overseas. This brought Germany into direct opposition with the fastest rising military force in Asia at the time, Imperial Japan. The collision between these two powers would prove decisive, not only for the outcome of regional dominance but also for Japan's emergence as a global player. Indeed, by the end of the First World War, Japan would count itself among the conflict's greatest beneficiaries. The war allowed Tokyo to expand its influence across China, acquire new territories, grow its commercial reach, and gain international recognition as a great power. Of all Japan's wartime operations, none carried greater symbolic and strategic weight than the assault on Germany's heavily fortified base at Jiaozhou Bay. This confrontation, fought in 1914, would culminate in the siege of the port city of Tsingtao, a decisive clash between Japan and Germany, unfolding decades before shifting geopolitics would later bind them together in a far more infamous alliance. Why Japan entered the war. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance. Japan's involvement in the First World War did not arise spontaneously. It was shaped by diplomatic agreements that predated the conflict itself. Chief among these was the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, first concluded in 1902. This treaty aligned Japanese and British interests in Asia and the Pacific, laying the groundwork for cooperation should either power face threats to its regional security. When war erupted in Europe in August 1914, this alliance would draw Japan into the global struggle on Britain's side, automatically placing her in opposition to Germany. At the outbreak of hostilities, British officials grew increasingly anxious about the presence of the Imperial German Navy's East Asiatic Squadron. Based in the Pacific, this powerful formation posed a serious threat to British merchant shipping and colonial communications across Asia. British planners quickly concluded that the Germans must be driven from their bases and cut off from resupply if the safety of imperial trade routes was to be preserved. Within days of war being declared, Britain reached out to Japan, requesting assistance in locating German naval movements. However, Japan had no intention of limiting its role to reconnaissance alone. Tokyo saw the war as a rare opportunity to advance its own strategic goals across the Asia-Pacific region. Rather than simply aiding Britain indirectly, Japan offered to formally enter the conflict as a belligerent on the Entente side. Britain accepted this proposal, albeit with hesitation. Privately, British officials cautioned Japan against occupying German island territories in the South Pacific, hoping instead that these possessions would eventually fall under the control of British dominions, such as Australia and New Zealand. Japan, however, had ambitions of its own and intended to pursue them regardless of quiet diplomatic warnings. Japan's objectives were clear and far-reaching. The German naval base at Singtao was a primary target, as were Germany's colonial holdings in the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands. Equally important was the desire to track down and neutralize the elusive East Asiatic Squadron before it could wreak havoc across Allied shipping lanes. The ultimatum: Germany's foothold in China threatened. On August 15, 1914, Japan delivered a stark ultimatum to Berlin. The Japanese government demanded that German warships withdraw from both Chinese and Japanese waters. and that control of the strategically vital port of Tsingtao be handed over without resistance. This demand struck at the heart of Germany's presence in East Asia. Germany ignored the ultimatum. When the deadline expired on August 23rd, Japan formally declared war. In Berlin, hopes rested on the belief that the garrison at Singtao might be able to withstand a siege long enough for Germany to achieve victory in Europe, thereby relieving pressure overseas. Acting on this expectation, German authorities instructed the governor of the Jiaozhou Bay concession, Alfred Meyer-Waldeck, to defend the settlement at all costs. Germany prepares to defend Singtao. When war began, Germany's naval forces in the Pacific were scattered across immense distances. Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee's East Asiatic Squadron was dispersed throughout the ocean, leaving Singtao largely isolated. With little prospect of immediate reinforcement, Meyer-Waldeck gathered every available vessel remaining in the harbor. The resulting naval force was modest at best. It consisted of the torpedo boat S-90, the lightly protected cruiser Cormoran, several gunboats, Lux, Tiger, Jaguar, and Iltis, and the Austro-Hungarian cruiser Kaiserin Elizabeth. Against the overwhelming strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this collection of ships stood little chance. Japan responded by dispatching its 2nd Squadron under Vice Admiral Sadakichi Kato, supported by British naval units, ensuring near-total maritime dominance. On land, Tsingtao's defenses were more substantial. The settlement was protected by multiple defensive belts stretching across the surrounding hills. The outermost line ran between the Kaiserstuhl and the Litzuner Heights, while a second line traversed the rugged terrain between Prinz Heinrich Hill and Cushion. The final defensive ring centered on 3 fortified elevations, Mount Moltke, Mount Bismarck, and Mount Iltis, each armed with heavy artillery. The town itself was further protected by coastal batteries and inland redoubts. Meyer-Waldeck commanded nearly 4,000 defenders, including Marines, naval gunners, sailors, reservists, and a small contingent of Chinese police. The garrison possessed dozens of artillery pieces, machine guns, motor vehicles, and even 2 early aircraft, primitive by modern standards, yet revolutionary for the time. The Japanese move-in, blockade, and first engagements. Even before Japan's declaration of war, skirmishes had begun to erupt. On August 22nd, German vessels laying mines outside the harbor were attacked by a British warship. After exchanging fire, the Germans withdrew under the protection of Tsingtao shore batteries. 5 days later, Vice Admiral Kato's fleet arrived and imposed a blockade on Jiaozhou Bay. Japanese forces swiftly seized nearby islands and began clearing minefields. Nature itself briefly intervened when a storm forced a Japanese destroyer aground, allowing a German gunboat to sortie and destroy it, one of the few early successes for the defenders. On September 2nd, Japanese troops began landing in force. Over 20,000 soldiers of the 18th Infantry Division came ashore with heavy artillery support. Their advance was slowed by devastating floods that turned roads into rivers of mud. Although local Chinese authorities protested the violation of neutrality, they offered no armed resistance. British concerns about Japanese intentions led to the dispatch of a small symbolic force from Tientsin, intended to ensure that Japan did not overreach its mandate. Nevertheless, Japanese troops steadily tightened their grip around the peninsula. Encirclement and the expanding siege. Faced with the scale of the invasion, Meyer-Waldeck withdrew his forces to the inner defensive lines. Meanwhile, Japan made history by deploying seaplanes from the carrier Wakamiya to scout and attack German positions. Though early bombing attempts were largely ineffective, these operations marked the birth of naval aviation. As German ships were stripped of their guns to strengthen land defenses, Japanese forces pushed deeper inland. Skirmishes erupted at outposts and towns, forcing German withdrawals. Flooding and logistical challenges slowed Japanese movement, prompting bold decisions to redeploy forces by sea and establish new landing zones. By mid-September, Singtao was fully surrounded. Japanese engineers constructed piers, airfields, and artillery positions, while reconnaissance aircraft dominated the skies. German aviation was reduced to a single pilot, Lieutenant Gunther Plaschow, whose daring flights became legendary. His reported aerial victory, achieved with a pistol fired from the cockpit, would, if accurate, represent the first such incident in history. The siege tightens, artillery, trenches, and storms, recognizing that maneuver warfare was no longer possible. Meyer-Waldeck ordered counterattacks and increased artillery fire, sometimes unleashing over 1,000 shells per day. These efforts failed to halt the Japanese advance. German warships bombarded Japanese flanks in support of retreats, but their impact diminished as Japanese artillery responded in kind. Inter-service rivalry within the Japanese military became apparent as naval and army commanders disagreed on targeting priorities. Meanwhile, the Germans prepared final defensive positions, including a fortified outpost atop Prinz Heinrich Hill, manned by a small but determined force. In the midst of a violent typhoon, Japanese troops assaulted this outpost. After brutal fighting and heavy casualties on both sides, the position fell. Japanese forces continued to advance methodically, constructing trenches ever closer to the city while British troops joined the front lines. Naval bombardments intensified. Floods claimed additional lives, and desperate German raids ended in disaster. One by one, German ships were scuttled to prevent capture. With supplies dwindling and defenses collapsing, the fate of Tsingtao was sealed. The final assault, the collapse of Tsingtao, the closing phase of the siege unfolded with sudden violence and irreversible momentum. In the darkness off the coast, the German torpedo boat S-90 achieved one last dramatic success. Slipping into the Japanese fleet, it launched a single torpedo that struck the cruiser Tokuchiho. The explosion ignited the ship's ammunition storage, ripping the vessel apart and sending it to the bottom with the loss of 256 Japanese sailors. It was the final meaningful naval blow struck by the defenders. Though S-90 managed to escape immediate destruction, its journey ended shortly thereafter when it was detained at a neutral Chinese harbor further along the coast. As October wore on, Allied pressure intensified. British reinforcements, including the 36th Sikh Regiment, came ashore at Lakan Bay, adding weight to the tightening noose around the city. Governor Meyer-Waldeck, increasingly aware that time was no longer on his side, authorized one last probing attack. Under cover of darkness, a small detachment of German troops attempted to crawl toward the Japanese trench system, but alert sentries detected the movement and drove the raiders back before they could cause damage. By the final week of October, the Japanese army had completed its preparations. Artillery batteries were fully emplaced, each stocked with ammunition sufficient for weeks of sustained fire. Major General Kamio ordered a systematic bombardment, directing every gun to maintain relentless daily barrages. At the same time, assault engineers organized specialized teams equipped with rifle grenades and improvised explosive charges packed into bamboo casings, tools designed for close-quarters trench warfare. On October 31st, coinciding deliberately with the birthday of Emperor Taisho, the full weight of Japanese and Allied firepower was unleashed. More than 100 field and naval guns opened fire simultaneously, guided by aerial observers, tethered balloons, and spotters positioned on captured high ground. German land batteries were smashed early in the assault, allowing Japanese sappers to advance hundreds of meters toward the defensive line. The redoubts suffered especially severe punishment, while nearby Chinese villages tragically endured collateral destruction from falling shells. With his remaining ships rendered useless, Meyer-Waldeck ordered the Kaiserin Elizabeth and Jaguar scuttled, their crews reinforcing the dwindling garrison. As November began, the bombardment shifted its focus to barbed wire entanglements and fortified strongpoints. Day by day, Japanese engineers crept closer, digging approach trenches under cover of artillery fire. Power stations were destroyed, defensive obstacles flattened, and water infrastructure seized, depriving the defenders of clean supplies. By early November, Singtao had been stripped of its last meaningful defenses. Recognizing the inevitability of defeat, Meyer-Waldeck made one final strategic decision. He ordered Lieutenant Gunther Pleschow to escape with dispatches for Berlin. Pleschow's flight ended abruptly in a rice field, forcing him to destroy his aircraft. What followed was an extraordinary odyssey across continents, culminating in his capture and later escape, cementing his legend long after the battle had ended. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders prepared the final blow. British engineers were given time to extend their own approaches, while Japanese units tested the German lines for weaknesses. Fighting erupted around the remaining redoubts, one after another. They fell under coordinated assaults, often following desperate bayonet charges from both sides. Some German counterattacks briefly regained ground, but were swiftly overwhelmed by superior numbers and coordination. In the early hours of November 7th, the final breakthrough came. Japanese troops stormed key hilltop batteries, collapsing the German defensive center. On Iltis Hill, brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted beneath sweeping searchlights, blades clashing in close quarters. With surrounding positions falling and no hope of relief, the remaining German stronghold surrendered. Meyer-Waldeck ordered white flags raised to spare further bloodshed. At dawn, Japanese and British troops marched into Tsingtao beneath clear skies, their victory cries echoing through the streets. For the defenders, the siege was over. Aftermath and legacy. The human cost of the campaign was stark. Japanese forces suffered hundreds of dead and over 1,000 wounded, while British casualties remained comparatively light. German losses were significant, and Chinese civilians paid a tragic price, caught between empires. Thousands of German soldiers were sent to prisoner of war camps in Japan, where many would spend the remainder of the war under humane conditions. Some never returned home, choosing instead to build new lives in Japan. Today, little visible evidence remains of Germany's colonial presence in Qingdao. Yet one legacy endures. The brewery established before the war still produces beer under the name Singtao, a quiet reminder of a forgotten battlefield where empires collided and history quietly turned.